Brush. I wonder when the last time you used a paintbrush was. Well, during lockdown, the kids in this house have been busy painting pebbles. There's a house nearby where outside on the roadside is what's become known as the Roundhay Adder, and people from all around the streets are painting pebbles and adding them to this adder as it snakes its way up the pavement. Well, Micah didn't paint stones, but the prophet Micah did paint a picture of what God is like. He's an early prophet, like Amos and Isaiah, prophesying in the northern kingdom in Israel, probably towards the end of the 8th century BC, perhaps as late as 715 BC. And he's from a rural area, so most of the prophets are preaching out of Jerusalem, the center of the action, but not Micah. He's in a village just to the southeast, Moresheth, which is quite near Bethlehem. And of course, it's in the book of Micah we get those famous verses often read in carol services, talking about how out of Bethlehem will come a ruler who will rule over his people Israel. Micah's also famous for all kinds of other verses, and we'll look at some of those later. But because he's rural, he uses rural imagery. So in chapter 4, he uses images of vines and figs. In chapter 2, he talks about how there'll be new leaders who will shepherd God's people. And it's often thought that Ezekiel uses that image of shepherd from Micah. He borrows it from Micah. And in fact, Ezekiel's not the only one to draw on Micah as a resource. Jeremiah in chapter 26 is also recorded as quoting some verses direct from Jeremiah chapter 3, an indictment that's lifted straight from Micah. But Jeremiah does him the good service of giving him credit for those words. You can check it out in Jeremiah 26 from verse 17 onwards. But Micah is really clear to those in Jerusalem. You are oppressing the poor. You are comfortable, you are wealthy, and yet you are oppressing the poor. And uses dramatic imagery in chapter 3, saying you are cannibalizing your own people. Wow, what a picture, a powerful picture of what oppression is like. Cannibalizing your own people. Much to reflect on there. Chapters 1 to 5, if you like, are a kind of overview, what we're used to in these prophetic books, where there is condemnation of how the people are living, the promise of judgment, and then the promise of reconciliation or restoration because of what God will do. And then chapters 6 and 7 are almost like a summary as Micah recaps all that he's been saying in those first 5 chapters in the final 2 chapters, chapters 6 and 7. But throughout Micah, we get these wonderful images of what God is like. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised because the name Micah means who is as Yahweh, or who is like Yahweh, or who is better than God. And it's a rhetorical question, of course. No one. And just like those middle verses in Lamentations that describe God's goodness, his mercy, and his compassion, what Micah does is to paint a picture of God's faithfulness, of God's loyalty, of God's compassion. In the midst of all that's going on, as people are cannibalizing one another, as the rich are oppressing the poor, Micah says, not so with God. God isn't like that at all. God is one who is loyal. God is one who is faithful. God is one who is compassionate. And Micah paints this beautiful image of what God is like, and then turns the paintbrush on us. And having described all of this darkness of how people are behaving, of what they're doing to one another, he paints this beautiful description of how God longs for us to be. Given all that God is, with his faithfulness, his compassion, and his loyalty, this is what God wants us to be like, he says, painting in this colourful image. What does the Lord require of you? Well, to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. It's a wonderful word picture of what it means to be a disciple, a follower of Jesus today. to be in relationship with God, to reflect God's goodness and compassion and grace, to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. It's there in verse 8 of chapter 6 of Micah. So Micah then, in the midst of this rural setting, makes links to the urban centre and says, come on, guys, get this right. We are God's people. Let's remember who he is, and let's mirror his compassion, his goodness, and his faithfulness as we embody his justice, his mercy or kindness, his humility. Let's do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly. Only 7 chapters then, but packs a huge amount in as Micah explores who God is and of who we're called to be in response. No wonder it is such a rich resource for those prophets who came later. And just as it was for them, so for us, words to read, to reflect on, and to dwell on, and allow those words to paint pictures in our minds of who God is and of who we might be in response.